Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at the world's news. And joining us this week, Karen DeYoung, Associate Editor and Senior National Security Correspondent of the Washington Post. Karen, wonderful to have you back. Also with us, Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs Columnist for the Financial Times. Gideon, joining us from London. Wonderful to have you. And finally, Prashant, who is the international editor of The Atlantic, also from London. Prashant, great to have you with us here. Well, lots of things to talk about. I think we'll talk at the end a little bit about the impact of the elections on U.S. foreign policy. But let's start with the news this morning that the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan, Karen, are here in Washington meeting with the Secretary of State in order to see if the quite brutal conflict that's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh can be ended. What is happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, Karen, and what do you expect to come out of the meeting today?
Well, just to kind of set the scenes, I think this part of the world is not on the top of everybody's pay attention list. Nagorno-Karabakh, of course, is a breakaway territory inside Azerbaijan that's populated and controlled by ethnic Armenians. Armenia, of course, is right next to Azerbaijan. They fought a war in the early 1990s because Azerbaijan said it wanted its territory back, and Armenia said, no, it should belong to us because we're the people who live there. That war ended with a sort of uneasy peace, and that's where they've sat with brief skirmishes ever since. About a month ago, it all flared up again, and they've been fighting each other. Mostly it's civilians who have borne the brunt of it. The OECD is trying to intervene. Putin has tried to intervene. Russia has tried to mediate. They've arranged 2 ceasefires in the past month, both of which have failed. And now Secretary Pompeo has stepped in and called the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan to meet with him separately. They don't want to meet together. The meeting with the Armenian has already taken place this morning. He left the State Department and didn't say anything to anybody, so we don't know what happened. And the Azerbaijan foreign minister is meeting right now with Secretary Pompeo. I don't think anybody holds out any great hopes that this is going to really change the situation very much. There have been lots of accusations and counter accusations. Human Rights Watch this week accused the Azeris of using cluster munitions. The Azeris have also been using drones, which they got from Turkey, who is their main backer in this dispute. I find it interesting that armed drones, which I think they got from Turkey and from Israel, have become such a factor in this situation. I recall when the Obama administration took over and continued Bush's use of armed drones in Pakistan against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and other groups. There was some concern raised inside the administration that, oh my gosh, if other people started using these weapons, this would be terrible. And they came up with a whole game plan of how that wasn't going to happen. But clearly it is happening, and there's concern now that not only will that continue in this particular dispute, but there are lots of other disputes, Serbia, Kosovo, various sides in Syria could pick up these weapons too. So I think that in this particular conflict, again, Putin said this week that his estimate is that 5,000 people have been killed, about evenly divided on both sides, most of them civilians. There are worries that it's going to draw Turkey on the side of Azerbaijan and Russia on the side of Armenia into the dispute. President Erdogan said just this morning of Turkey, said, well, why is Russia mediating this dispute? Why is the United States? We have an interest there. We ought to be part of of the negotiating teams, we want to sit at the table. So I think that nothing really good is happening there. There are lots of other interests that are involved, gas pipelines from Azerbaijan. So I think that there are worries that it could not only escalate, but could expand to include other more powerful nations as well. Nobody's very optimistic about it at the moment.
Gideon, how does it look from a European perspective? Of course, the French, together with the U.S. and Russia, are co-chairs of the so-called OSCE Minsk group, and the French foreign ministers also tried, I think, to get a ceasefire going. But there is a larger context, I think, as Karen put it. The Turkish involvement, of course. Russia is a neighbor and nearby. In fact, has a base, I believe, in Armenia itself. Is there a concern that this small conflict that has long been ignored might, in fact, get on the front pages of the papers because of the significance drawing in others or for other reasons?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's much public concern. I mean, as you say, it's a relatively obscure dispute even in Europe, which is not to say it's not important, but it's not making big headlines. But I think among people who worry about foreign policy and it's interesting because neither of the major protagonists, or outside protagonists, Erdogan and Putin, are exactly popular in Western Europe. Putin for obvious reasons, post Crimea and so on. But there's been growing concern about the way that Turkey is behaving in the wider neighborhood. They've intervened not only in Syria, but in Libya, in the Eastern Mediterranean, now in Nagorno-Karabakh, and there's this sort of sense that Erdogan is on a roll, increasingly willing to use force, willing to take risks, and potentially quite a dangerous player, but also one that we can't afford to antagonize because Turkey controls so many refugees. There's something like 4 million on their territory because it's an important country anyway, it's a NATO member and so on. Then within that, there's a division between France and Germany, actually, with the French much more confrontational towards Turkey. And it's perhaps slightly awkward that they're the member of the Minsk group because they're not really representative of the European mainstream. The Germans more saying, look, Erdogan's a difficult character, but we've got to deal with him, and maybe Turkey has some legitimate complaints in the Eastern Med and so on. So there's concern mixed with uncertainty about the right way forward on this, and also interest about how is Russia going to play this, because compared to Erdogan, Putin seems relatively restrained on this one. And somebody was pointing out this morning that although Russia's normally portrayed as being in Armenia's corner, his public pronouncements have been quite balanced between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And yet, if the Azerbaijanis/Turks were to prevail, that could be a bit of a blow for Russia's influence in the region. Armenia is closer to them; they've got a mutual defense agreement with them, so it's a tricky one for Russia as well.
It should be said that Putin, as Gideon pointed out, has made several conciliatory statements this week. He said he greeted the U.S. intervention with some hope. I mean, he basically said that's a good thing. NATO, on the other hand, the Armenian president spoke with Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, this week, and Stoltenberg came out and made a statement and said, "Whoa, we don't have a dog in this fight. NATO has nothing to do with this. We have partnership agreements with Azerbaijan and Armenia. They're both good partners. Hope they work it out."
Yeah, Prashant, it looks like there is sort of the collective, we know this can go out bad, but there's this collective hand washing going on. And I think the NATO statement, perhaps the NATO Secretary General statement, sort of underscoring that. And yet the conflict is intensifying. And we know that these things can escalate in ways that are problematic. How do you see it?
I think that's a great point. I mean, this idea that there's a lot of things to unpack here, but one of the crucial points is, this is obscure is perhaps not the appropriate word to use, but it's the word. I think we understand what we all mean here. It's not at the sort of center of a lot of our kind of attention spans at the moment, particularly with the American election coming in. I know we'll talk about that later. I think the interesting thing about this is, to me, it really illustrates one of the reasons why I don't think this is going to calm down anytime soon. There's not going to be a return to the sort of 1994 status quo. It's pretty clear Azerbaijan sees an opportunity here. You know, I was in Baku. I spent a Christmas in Baku 3 years ago. I mean, you know, one of the interesting things is you can really see how much oil wealth has transformed that country on a day-to-day basis. And that has genuinely transformed its military too. And so the driving factors that sort of led to that ceasefire and that kind of tenuous agreement in the 90s, those factors no longer are, I mean, those factors have radically changed now. And so, you asked how I see it. I don't think it's going to get better anytime soon, simply because one, Washington's attention is distracted for the immediate, just with what's happening on the 3rd of November. And it's not clear that DC is a defining actor in this anyway. And quite frankly, it's not clear why Baku would want to concede at the moment.
Karen, you and I think we lost Gideon for a moment, but he'll hopefully can dial back in. Karen, you mentioned the drone issue as a particular frightening part of the escalation that we're seeing, not only in this conflict, but the possibility of it happening in other places. Do you hear in your reporting here in Washington that people are concerned about it? I saw that David Ignatius had a column about seeing if there might be a no drone fly zone established by the United States and France and Russia in order to sort of get at the de-escalation that way. What do you hear about the willingness to look at this conflict in a way that allows for perhaps more serious diplomatic and even military intervention on the part of the U.S. and France?
Well, I know David did suggest that. I don't know if any of the players have proposed it. I don't know if that's something that that Pompeo is going to propose in these talks today. But again, I think that, armed drones are really dangerous weapons, and the proliferation, you see in the Persian Gulf where the United States, to a large extent, has refused to sell them, although I think they're inching in that direction, but they've bought them from China. And so it's like that cat was out of the bag a long time ago. And even if they succeed in saying, well, we're not going to use these in this particular conflict, I think that we're going to see them pop up more and more and more. Again, I don't know if anyone has proposed that, or if that's something the Azerbaijanis would accede to. Tensions are running really high, nationalistic tensions on both sides. Azerbaijan feels like it's been cheated out of territory that's supposed to belong to it. Armenia goes all the way back to the Ottoman Empire and says the Turks once again are trying to kill us off and take territory away from us. So these are very old conflicts, and the application of these relatively new weapon systems have changed the whole face of it.
And yet, Prashant, it seems that it is Turkey that is providing these weapons to the Azerbaijanis, and Turkey is an ally of the United States. You would hope that perhaps the United States would be able to have some influence on Ankara to turn this down. Do you see any effort by the United States to try to mold Turkish foreign policy in a more stabilizing way? And there's Gideon. We're glad to have you back, although your name.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Yes, I seem to be Edward Luce now, but anyway. Hold on.
That's okay. We're still in Nagorno-Karabakh. And
good. Have things advanced since I dropped off the call?
Not at all.
Okay. You might have solved it by now.
Exactly. Prashant, on the Turkey issue.
Yeah, I think the Turkey issue is a great question to ask, because it speaks to a broader question as to American influence more generally, right? I mean, Turkey is just one example of, what certainly I see as the long-term, though accelerated in the past 4 years, decline of American influence worldwide over medium and large-sized actors who have some measure of regional dominance. Turkey is a great example where we have seen, as years have gone by, that Erdogan has been, less and less of a receptive ally. I mean, if you were to describe a country like Turkey, it would not sound like a NATO member at the moment. The notion that the United States has any influence over Ankara at the moment, I mean, I'm sure it does. It's just, I think the amount of that influence has to be very much in question, given the events of past years. And, the American president has had this on again, off again relationship with Erdogan in the past years that does not indicate some kind of long-term diplomatic bonhomie.
Well, clearly an issue that is going to stay with us, at least the Turkey issue, for whoever wins on November 3rd. I think we can all predict that Turkey will be one of the issues high on the agenda for the next president to figure out how to deal with. Let's move on to another perennial problem or a perennial issue, Gideon, happening in your country. We are, 2.5 months away from the deadline for the full implementation of Brexit. There is continuing talk between London and Brussels about the potential of a trade deal. Let me help us set the scene. Where are we today in that negotiation, and how do you think that's going to evolve?
Well, we're now in what both sides claim is the kind of final sprint, or the other metaphor they use is the tunnel, to try to get a deal. The word or sort of atmospherics are better. Maybe a week or two ago, Britain was saying, sending out very angry messages, saying, Europe's not negotiating in good faith, we're very unhappy, and all of that stuff. And you duly had a headline saying, there may be no deal, it could all break down. At the time, there were a lot of people who were fairly skeptical about this and thought it was just theatrics, that Johnson, to keep his own party on side, has to be reasonably confrontational with the European Union so that it can be presented as a victory, a hard-fought negotiation, which is not to say the issues are non-existent. They are real. I mean, the questions around fisheries, which is a tiny industry, but, important communities that potentially can cut up very rough on either side of the channel if they feel they've been badly dealt with. And also around state aid, to industry, which Britain, having been in a period when they would say we would never want to do that anyway, now sees as possibly an important issue in current circumstances. So those issues need to be resolved. But the current betting is that they will be, and that we will have a deal, and that this will all be announced as, good news, which in relative terms it is, and will probably be ratified in time for Britain to have a deal in place by the time we leave. Finally, we're like this guest that keeps sort of leaving the door and saying, I'm really about to leave now. I know, but now we're actually finally about to leave the door. But I think amidst all that, the thing that is a bit depressing, if like me, you were never that convinced this is a great idea, is that the reality is that even if we get a deal, the conditions that British industry will face after January the 1st and the British people will face will be significantly worse, because although we formally left the European Union as a legal entity and we no longer go to the meetings, at the beginning of this year, the actual trading terms and the travel terms have remained unaltered. From January the 1st, they do actually change. And so industry will encounter a huge amount of new paperwork. And we may get these massive traffic jams going in and out of the few channel ports, Dover particularly, as suddenly truck drivers have to produce papers and have them scanned in a way that they didn't before. And although the government had originally said, it'll be seamless, you won't notice the difference, we can't help noticing they're building huge lorry parks in Kent, a rather attractive county, which now appears to be about to be paved over and turned into a lorry park so that we can allow trade to keep continuing. So I think that the big picture is that even if we get a deal, Britain's going to suffer, I think, in economic terms, because a lot of people who might marginally have done business with us before, but could do it, might choose not to in the future, just because it's just a bit more hassle than it was before. And why not seek out a trade partner on continental Europe that's still inside the EU?
Karen, as this evolves, Washington used to look at London as really its big entry point into Europe, and whether there's a deal or not a deal, the UK is not going to be part of the European Union and won't have a voice within the European Union discussions. What impact does that have on Washington's view about how it needs to relate to Europe through the UK, or is that relationship really going to change in a pretty fundamental way?
Well, I think we don't know yet. The underlying a lot of Boris Johnson's sort of hard line on all.
You just went mute. There you go.
That underlying a lot of the hard line that Boris Johnson has had, at least publicly, is that there is going to be a U.S.-UK trade deal, and that will, the UK is the biggest European investor in this country, and that will continue. But I think, we don't see that deal yet. And I think that Gideon's right. It's going to be really complicated, much more than a lot of people think. Just in Britain, with its relations with Europe, when you see trucks backed up, you already see the customs service saying, "Whoa, wait a minute, we don't have nearly enough people to deal with this." And as they are trying to get into this new world, to be negotiating with the United States, where the distractions in this country are going to be huge. I don't think that deal is going to come anytime in the near future, and it's going to leave the UK to some extent in limbo. They did sign a deal with Japan this week, but the Japanese are very nervous about it because they don't quite know what's going to happen in Britain, the UK on its own. Once this goes into effect, assuming that they'll get some kind of a deal, which I think everybody assumes they probably will.
Prashant, when you walk around and talk to folks in London, what sense do you get about the debate within Britain about its role not only in Europe but its global role? Is there a new sort of British foreign policy that might emerge from this decision? Or how does Britain look at its role going forward? For 40 years, it was through Europe and being the bridge between Washington and Brussels. How does Britain look at it today in a post-Brexit environment?
I mean, I think both Karen and Gideon sort of raised good points, and I'd be interested to hear what Gideon says about this in particular. But it sounds, there's, I think, a gulf between the rhetoric of what Britain believes its role will be and the reality of what Britain believes its role will be. Now, if you were to listen to, I think, advocates of Brexit, in good faith, I think they make the case that, this frees Britain up to, be quote unquote global Britain. This is the kind of the argument that they make, that, suddenly it's opened up to be an actor free of the EU. And so can be, it can form de facto alliances as they have with Canada on stronger sanctions against Belarus, because the EU is caged in by a Cypriot kind of move against all of these various factions. So I think if you were to sort of take that on its face, it's really hard to make the case that Britain is still that kind of powerful actor. We can cherry pick these examples where, sure, Britain can ally with Canada, it can ally with the Five Eyes countries to have a more kind of foreign policy that is more aggressive, more human rights driven, all of the various things that, they would make the case for, more open to trade. And yet, we have to sort of also make the point that if we've learned anything from the past 4 years of Trump in the White House and, post-Brexit foreign policy, is that you have to link economic strength with foreign policy power to some degree or another. And Gideon's point that the British economy is going to weaken, it's even in the best case projections, we're talking about a break-even economic kind of situation over the next 5, 10, 15 years. That would indicate that Britain's foreign policy will necessarily be curtailed. This pandemic and the sort of enormous amounts of debt that Britain is understandably taking on to sort of fund and expanded public services to vulnerable populations also means that it will be curtailed in issues to do with defense spending, where Britain was already sort of reducing the sort of expansiveness of its military, in terms of its foreign policy, in terms of its foreign aid. All of these various factors will necessarily be curtailed. And so I think there's, we have to always think of what Britain says it wants to be, which is, sure, global Britain, and what Britain can actually be, which is really not going to be a global Britain.
Gideon, how do you see that?
Well, I mean, I think Prashant's totally right that Britain's ambitions and the tools to achieve those ambitions, there's a huge and probably widening disjuncture, and the military is one area to look at that. So I've been talking to a lot of the people who are involved in the strategic review that Downing Street is currently taking on foreign policy. But, they, in moments of frankness, will say, well, a hell of a lot of this depends on the spending review, because we don't know how much money we're going to get. So what we can afford in military terms. And there's going to be less money, obviously, because of the pandemic. So, but I think the one interesting aspect in both trade and strategic terms is whether Britain sort of emulates America in pivoting towards the Pacific. Does that make any sense for the UK? In trade terms, there may be something going on in the sense that Prashant mentioned the Japan, or Karen as well, the Japan treaty. But I think that the aspiration for the Brits now is to join what used to be this TPP until America left. I think it's the CPTPP. But anyway, a big Asian, Pan-Pacific trading alliance. Why would Britain be part of that? It doesn't really, geographically doesn't make sense, although apparently we could claim through Diego Garcia to have some sort of foothold in the Pacific. But in geostrategic and even in economic terms, it might make sense. So that I think that, say, the Japanese are really quite keen. They didn't want Britain to leave the EU. It's a pain for them because they've got a lot of car plants here. But now that we have, they say, well, actually, maybe you could join this, because for Japan, they'd quite like to see another, G20 member, Security Council member, kind of integrated into Asia, both for economic, but also increasingly for strategic reasons, if they can sort of get Britain in there. And the other parts of that, like Australia, might be keen. And that could have, to be honest, I'm not enough of an economist or a trade specialist to know whether it makes any real material difference to the UK. But it's certainly something they're looking at. And bizarrely, if a Biden administration was somehow to rejoin that, it could be a kind of trade deal with America through the back door via the Pacific. I mean, maybe we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. But that's the kind of thing that they are thinking about. And in strategic terms, the British are thinking about their shrinking military. Where do they deploy it? There's some say, look, we've got too many threats on close to home, see Russia, to consider sending half the Navy around the world to join in freedom of navigation operations with the United States and Australia and India. Others say, well, actually, we've got these aircraft carriers we don't know what to do with. And it might be a way of reasserting sort of global Britain, provided we put them out of harm's way, or at least integrated them with the Americans sufficiently that the Chinese didn't pick them off. And as a way of almost a quid pro quo, because you're getting these increasingly vocal American demands that Europeans pull their weight more in terms of global security. Well, if the British and the French start showing up in the Pacific, that might be a way of kind of making that point as well.
I think the five. Prashant, go ahead.
Yeah. Just to follow on from Gideon's point on the U.S. trade deal, which everyone has kind of discussed, it's kind of interesting to me how the legacy of Britain's deal with the EU will loom quite large, and how this election in November also goes will have a lot of impact. We've already seen Nancy Pelosi and sort of Biden supporters come out and say that the U.S. will not support a British trade deal if there's any kind of threat to the Good Friday Agreement. And this is, one, there's diplomatic niceties, but there are also American politics at play here as well, which is, to my understanding, there are lots of sort of Irish American communities that take a great interest in American sort of support for the Good Friday Agreement. And so any question as to whether Britain continues to support it or allows conflict to erupt on the island of Ireland could also have an impact on a future trade deal, which Johnson has like trumpeted over and over again. And so we can't also think that on January 1st, whether or not there's a deal, Britain will start carte blanche with sort of the ability to negotiate. In fact, there will be this looming legacy of how it dealt with Europe and how it continues to deal with Europe in terms of its ability to seek other trade deals elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the British government is quite nervous about Biden for that reason, because I think they perhaps overdo the extent to which he is, in the pocket of Irish America or anti-British. You hear some of that, but they are concerned that, in a sense, Ireland may be given a veto over any putative trade deal with the United States, because if the Irish were to turn up and say, you know what, this actually imperils the deal, that probably would tip it in Capitol Hill. But I think the other thing is, I'm just not sure. I mean, Ivo, you'd be closer to it, and so would Karen, how interested the United States would be in a trade deal, or at least Biden would be. As far as I can tell from their manifesto, they're very cautious about the idea of new trade deals. It's sort of one lesson they've learned from losing to Trump in 2016 is that the constituency for new free trade deals is quite limited.
But I think, too, that Biden is very pro-Europe and very pro-EU. He sees that as his, and he says EU specifically. He looks at it as an economic bloc that, together with the United States, gives more power for negotiating with China. He sees that as a path to kind of rebuild U.S. influence in the world, and certainly vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, which is, again, emphasizes why it's so much in Britain's interests not to have an antagonistic relationship with the EU, right, both for its own sake, but also because it then, potentially complicates things with certainly with the Democratic administration. I mean, actually, that's one of the real kind of interesting divisions. I think if Trump came in again, he would actually be quite keen to use the UK as a lever against the EU. Whereas Biden would do exactly the opposite.
Well, we'll be there. We'll talk about those issues after the election as we get there. But let's pivot to Asia, since we've already pivoted a little bit, and particularly, Prashant, to Taiwan, which really quite suddenly has become an issue, at least in foreign policy circles in Washington. With the argument that it's time for us to clarify whether or not we would actually defend Taiwan, and to say so publicly, in particular because the Chinese are saber rattling all over the place. Why is the Taiwan issue all of a sudden on the agenda, and how's the debate evolving?
So I think there are a number of factors that have brought Taiwan to the fore. One is, of course, Taiwan's management of the pandemic has been exemplary. Its economy is sort of seemingly back on track. The number of infections and fatalities as a result of the coronavirus have been relatively limited. And it has a dynamic democratic government, small d democratic. And its elections recently were really quite something to behold. And then, there are other regional factors. China's aggressiveness in Hong Kong and the imposition of the national security law over the summer really sort of undermine the notion that a one country, two systems approach that Beijing had long trumpeted for Hong Kong. And Ivo, as you know, I was in Hong Kong just last week. This kind of undermines that very notion, and Beijing had long said that Taiwan would be subject to a one country, two systems approach. And we have seen over the past 2 years a greater degree of fraternity between Hong Kong pro-democracy activists and Taiwan. And then further from that, there is also the fact that the 10th of October was Taiwanese National Day. We've seen greater degrees of Chinese aggression through military means in the vicinity of Taiwan. And just general undermining of a variety of different things. There was a de facto marine border that China has shown less and less respect for. And so Taiwan has come up as more and more of an issue. I think the difficulty here is, deciding to explicitly say that the United States will defend Taiwan it's not a single issue policy. It's an all of government kind of approach that will suddenly require the United States to do a number of different things far beyond simply, articulating a defense policy towards towards Taiwan, important though it is. I think it sort of understates the impact of such a shift in policy.
Gideon, you had a column on this very issue in the FT on Tuesday. How do you see this evolving?
Yeah, I think it's it is a very alarming situation. I mean, on the specific thing that Prashant was talking about, should America extend an explicit security guarantee? Obviously, there's a risk involved in that China would see that as a provocation. I mean, its aim is to make them less likely to attack, but you have to consider the possibility that it might make them more likely to attack because they would see it as this change in the status quo, as a casus belli, etc. But I mean, what's going on in their heads is obviously key, but the rhetoric coming out of Beijing is alarming. I mean, obviously, we use the phrase state-controlled media, so nothing appears there that isn't within the grounds of permissibility. So if you read, say, the Global Times, which is a nationalist paper, but it's full of blood-curdling stuff now about preparing for war, preparing for the final resolution of the Taiwan issue. Reports leaked, I'm sure deliberately, to the South China Morning Post of the assembly of invasion forces opposite Taiwan, increasing provocations in terms of crossing this median line, and also some of the offshore islands controlled by Taiwan may be being threatened now by China. So the rhetoric is blood-curdling. And I suppose one of the things that worries people in Taiwan and elsewhere is if there's like a prolonged period of uncertainty after the American election, particularly if there were a contested election and America seemed to be in chaos, there might be a temptation for China to take a risk, particularly given that Xi Jinping has made this his signature issue, has said repeatedly that, this can't pass on from generation to generation. China needs to resolve it now. And, just these are anecdotes, but like a member of my family who studies Chinese and was going to go to Taiwan was suddenly getting anxious messages from friends in the mainland saying, don't go, there's going to be a war. But that's what they are picking up from their own media. Now, most Western analysts that I know don't think there's going to be a war. They say it would just be such an undertaking for China. It's a big sea, 60 miles, something like that, you have to cross. There's no signs of them assembling the kind of military force that you would need to do that. So a full-on invasion would involve heavy casualties, even if they would prevail. Ultimately, is China really prepared for that? So that seems why one hopes at the unlikely end of things. But I mean, maybe one has to worry more about just provocations. There are these outlying islands. There's one called the Pratas Islands, which are not occupied, which China might try and seize, or the two that caused, troubles back in the 1950s, wasn't it? Kemoe and Matsu, they're still there. That kind of thing might happen. So yeah, I think it is pretty concerning. But you're the former ambassador to NATO. What do you think?
Well, I think there is a tension here that is happening, and the question I think for Washington is what to do, how to signal this. And Karen, there seems to be a debate going on. I don't know whether it's inside the administration, but certainly outside the administration, on how to deal with Taiwan. And the Hill, which has a major voice, has long had a major voice on this issue, is making moves to strengthen the ties between the U.S. and Taiwan. How do you see this playing out, particularly given that there's an election happening at the same time? And is there a difference between the two parties on this issue?
Well, I think, in to some extent, it's sort of become a vicious circle. The Chinese do exercises, they cross the line across which they're not supposed to cross in the sea. They provoke, they threaten. The United States, at the same time, has increased both the quantity and the quality of the weaponry that it's providing Taiwan, while still saying, as Secretary Pompeo said this week, our policy continues to be that we only provide defensive weapons and we maintain strategic ambiguity. This week, the administration announced that they were selling $1 billion in new attack missiles to Taiwan. Are those defensive or are they offensive? one can argue it either way. The Chinese came out last night and said, well, we will be forced to retaliate unless this is stopped. The United States must withdraw this. So I think you have a division between people who say the sort of hawks, both in Taiwan and in Washington, who say, look, enough with strategic ambiguity. We need strategic clarity. Let's say, China, you've gone too far, and we will defend Taiwan. A lot of others say, whoa, why would we want to do this? We need to really start thinking about what US interests are versus what Taiwanese interests are, and to keep very clear in our own heads what our own interests are here. So I think, yeah, you're right, that there is a lot of division. I don't know to what extent it is within the administration. I think most of the sort of principal players on China are pretty hawkish in the administration, and that also coincides obviously with a lot of people in Congress. And the president, as he kind of makes China part of his campaign with a responsibility to virtually all ills at the moment, certainly feeds into that. But Taiwan essentially sort of becomes a pawn, both in the U.S. election campaign and on the ground as the United States tries to be tougher with China. And again, I go back to this vicious circle. The tougher the United States, the more it rattles its sabers, the more China provokes, and vice versa.
In the meantime, although this seems to be a triangle between Taiwan, US, and China, there are a lot of interested parties looking at the signaling that is being done, including the allies in East Asia, and particularly the Japanese, who are worried about whether or not the United States will be there if the Chinese move against them, the South Koreans, who are more worried about what's happening in North Korea, the Australians, who may be far away from any place, but are increasingly looking at China as a big problem. And of course, our European allies are looking at this and said, our alliance is still central to American foreign policy. And Prashant, is that a consideration that ought to be taken into account as the U.S. tries to approach this without trying to provoke China at the same time? It's what diplomacy is about: alliance management and deterrence. Hard things to do, but necessary.
You're absolutely right. None of these issues are about the country themselves in a vacuum. Strategic ambiguity is a very worthwhile policy when you are confident the American president will uphold Article 5. But if those two things do run in tandem, if you're not confident that the US president will sort of send in the full might of the American military to defend Taiwan, are you fully confident that he would to defend a NATO ally? And so all of these things do link together. How the United States behaves on Taiwan certainly has outsized impact. You're right to point out, far outside the region, though of course also within the region itself to a greater degree. China increasingly projects power around the world, not just in its immediate neighborhood.
We only got a couple of minutes left, and so I'm going to do something that we normally don't do. There's been this push by the administration to try to get a foreign policy success, and they've had some, UAE and Bahrain opening to Israel. If you had to guess in the next 10 days, Karen, Prashant, then Gideon, what foreign policy success will come forward out of all the attempts that are happening there, where would you put your money? Karen?
I think there's a good chance that they'll get a one-year extension on the New START treaty. It looked like they're heading in that direction. I think there's sort of a chance that Sudan will go ahead and say it's going to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. We don't have time to talk about how problematic that would be in some respects for Sudan's future, but those are two things that I think might happen.
Prashant, do you agree, or any others?
No, I defer to Karen. She would know this far better than I. Those two sound exactly right to me in terms of the highest likelihood.
Gideon, what do you see coming down?
Well, I mean, you're sitting in the States, but my guess is that neither Sudan nor the New START treaty would make any material effect on the election. So if they're really looking for something to unveil before the election, it would have to involve China or possibly Russia. And I worry that it might be more effective to have something confrontational rather than, you know, I don't see many ribbon cutting ceremonies with President Xi Jinping coming up, but you know, you could have a crisis, manufactured or otherwise, in which Trump gets to look tough and decisive, and to put Biden on the spot. You know, how would you deal with this? But you know, it's getting quite close to the wire now. So I think maybe we're running out of time for October surprises. I hope so.
Well, with 50 million people having already voted in the United States, which is more than all of the people who voted early in 2016, time is literally running out in that way. But there is no doubt that foreign policy, although it probably has little impact on the election, will remain uppermost in a mind at least of us and the audience that joins us weekly. Again, great discussion. Gideon Rachman, Prashant Rao, Karen DeYoung, thanks so much for joining us this week for World Review. And I want to wish all of you a very good weekend. And for those Americans listening, if you haven't voted, please do. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.